Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us today. I'm Captain Thomas Brown, Managing Partner for Insurance here at ShorelineHudson, and I'm delighted to welcome you today to today's webinar, Navigating STR Section 301 China-linked port fees in the United States. We're very pleased to see participants from across the shipping, insurance, and compliance sectors representing ship owners, managers, and insurance brokers worldwide. So before we begin, let's just get a few keeping reminders away. All attendees' microphones are muted to avoid background noise. Please use the Teams chat panel on the right-hand side of your screen to send questions in writing at any time. And we'll read these questions towards the end, and any that we refer to will be handled anonymously. The session is being recorded, and a replay link plus a copy of the slides will be circulated to all attendees after the event. And finally, just a short disclaimer, the information shared today doesn't constitute legal advice. It represents our best understanding of the current situation as of today, October the 31st. It is intended to help clients interpret and manage their compliance exposure in the United States at this time. Okay, so today's discussion is going to follow four simple themes. Why has the United States introduced this port fee regime? What types of vessel are going to be affected by these fees? How are owners, managers going to prepare to deal with this situation? And finally, what's next as Washington refines its position and what's going to happen as a consequence of the current pause that's been placed on this fee regime? So with that, I'm pleased to hand over to Andrew Baskin. You may have heard from Andrew before on our podcast series. He's our global policy advisor who's been tracking the issue directly in Washington, D.C. So handing over to you, Andrew.
Great. Thank you, Tom. I saw that we had a message in the chat that there may have been an audio difficulty. Can someone chime in to see, can you hear us better now? This is before we share a screen and do that. All good. Wonderful. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Tom, let's see if I can share a screen effectively here. These slides up. Are we sharing screen well, Tom? We see the
slides. All looks good.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah. Perfect. Excellent. Well, as Tom said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us to talk about a topic that has gone through a lot of changes this year. Now may be going through more changes based on an announcement yesterday, although nothing is formalized. So we'll carry on with kind of business as usual, at least for now, talking about this still new this year U.S. policy regarding the imposition of fees on Chinese-linked vessels. So let's take a look. Before we kind of dive into the details of these port fees, we need to start with a quick update. That yesterday there was an announcement in the media about a potential 1-year suspension of the port fees that the United States and China have been imposing on vessels linked to each other. The Chinese government released a press release. The United States Trade Representative announced such to the media. But there's been nothing official yet from the U.S. government, at least as of about 30 minutes ago was the last time we were kind of on and looking. And of course, as we all know, U.S. trade policy has been very unpredictable over the past 9 months, with changes at times happening almost overnight. But what we do know right now, at least, is there appears to be a 1-year pause on these fees. It hasn't been formally confirmed. So we still need to stay prepared, regardless of whether or for how long these fees end up being suspended, or if they just simply end up being modified. So with that said, over the next 30 minutes or so, we'll explore how trade policy, logistics, and risk management are all converging via this port fee regime. This policy change, it's creating enormous ripple effects. It's been driving up freight costs. It's been forcing fleet reshuffles. It's even prompted some boardroom shakeups. So it's a pretty important topic for all of us to understand. So here are the contents of this presentation. We'll talk about why these fees have been imposed. We'll talk about what these fees actually are. We'll talk about how they're being implemented, and then what happens next, or at least what we think the implications could be if this policy stays in place. So let's jump right in with a little bit of some overarching context. So why has all this been happening now? Why has all this been happening this year? So, as we all know, for years, China has been strategically investing in creating and maintaining a dominant position in the global shipbuilding and logistics sectors. They have built the world's largest shipyards. They subsidize state-owned enterprises. They've greatly expanded their maritime footprint. In response, the US Trade Representative then took a fairly bold step. They imposed new port fees on vessels linked to China. These fees, just as they stand now, apply to ships built in China, ships owned or operated by Chinese entities, and then a slight kind of twist on the Chinese link is that it's any. They also are being imposed on any foreign-built vehicle carrier, just about any foreign-built vehicle carrier calling it a U.S. port. The goal, ostensibly, the stated goal, has been to rebalance the playing field and reduce the United States' reliance on Chinese maritime infrastructure. So that's the sort of overarching geopolitical context. Let's talk now about the legal foundation behind these new fees. So they are being implemented under Section 301 of the U.S. Trade Act of 1974. And that is a tool that gives the U.S. Trade Representative, or USTR, as we'll call it for the rest of this presentation. It gives USTR the authority to respond when another country's trade practices are found to be unfair or harmful to U.S. interests. And in this case, in 2024, to say last year during the previous government, USTR began an investigation into China's maritime and logistics practices. And USTR concluded that this year, after that investigation was complete, that those practices are both unreasonable and burdensome to U.S. commerce. That determination, then, is what gives the U.S. government the legal basis to act. That's the why. Now let's look at the what. So USTR has taken this legal authority to act, and then they did so, or they have done so, through the imposition of port fees on certain vessels. This fee regime is organized, as you can see on the screen, through 4 annexes, and each one defines a different category of vessels that are subject or could be subject to these charges. Annex 1 covers Chinese vessel operators and owners. In other words, ships that are controlled or managed by Chinese entities, so regardless of where they're registered. Annex 2 applies to Chinese built vessels, even if they're owned or operated by non-Chinese companies or people. Annex 3 focuses, as we've said, on foreign built vehicle carriers. And then finally, Annex 4 covers LNG carriers. It's an important point to note, though, that these annexes are not cumulative. What that means is that a vessel can only fall under one category. There's no double charging, there's no overlap between the annexes or the fees imposed by each annex. And there's a sort of priority list to look at in determining which annex a vessel might be subject to. And you can see that on the right side of the screen in the sub list at the bottom. If a vessel falls under the restrictions of Annex 4, it will not be charged any fees under Annexes 1, 2, or 3. If the vessel is not subject to Annex 4, we look to see if it's subject to Annex 3, if it's a vessel carrier. And then if a vessel is not subject to 4 or 3, we look to see if it's owned or operated by a Chinese entity, then the fees under Annex 1 would apply. And then finally, if we've exhausted the other 3 annexes, we can look to see if the vessel's Chinese built, and then those Annex 2 fees would apply. So, as we just mentioned, let's look at each annex then in turn. As we've just mentioned, Annex 1 targets ships owned or operated by Chinese individuals or companies. Currently, at least as of today, Chinese owned or operated vessels are assessed a $50 per net ton fee. And that's calculated, all these fees are calculated per rotation of US port calls. That means that each full cycle of port visits to the United States triggers one charge. So if a vessel, say, calls the Port of Los Angeles, a vessel that's subject to the Annex 1 fee, calls the Port of Los Angeles, it'll pay the fee. But then if that vessel proceeds from the port of Los Angeles to, say, the port of Seattle, Tacoma, it will not again be charged that fee when it calls at Seattle, Tacoma. It won't be charged until it leaves the United States, it returns to Shanghai, Busan, wherever it might be, takes on additional cargo, comes back to the United States for another cycle. These charges under Annex 1, they will increase over time, up to $140 per net ton by 2029. And there are essentially no exemptions to Annex 1. Interestingly, in Annex 1, the formal wording in USTR's notice of action is, quote, any vessel with a Chinese operator or owned by an entity of China. And USTR's definition of what it means to be of China for the purposes of this fee is very expansive. You can see the list on the right side of the screen. It's a wide-ranging list. And even that last bullet is itself very broad, as it encompasses, for example, entities that have just 25% or more direct or indirect equity ownership held by Chinese nationals or residents. So, moving on to Annex 2. This section, this annex, focuses not on who operates the vessel, but instead where the vessel was built. So it targets Chinese-built vessels, even if they're owned or operated by non-Chinese individuals or companies. Under Annex 2, the fee calculation is a little bit more involved. It's calculated as the higher of two measures. Well, excuse me, it's more involved if it's a vessel that carries containers. We need to look at two different potential measures. There could either be a tonnage-based fee, which as of right now is $18 per net ton, or a per container discharged fee for container ships, and that's $120 per container. So the fee charged will be whichever is higher of these two fees. So a container vessel built in China, we would need to do two calculations, determine which is higher, and that would indicate the fee that needs to be paid. A vessel not carrying containers would just look at the tonnage fee. Then you can also see on the screen how these fees, just like the Annex 1 fees do, they rise over time. One of the key differences between Annex 2 and Annex 1, though, is with Annex 2, there's some pretty important exemptions. Smaller vessels, short sea operators, ships participating in U.S. government programs, such as carrying defense cargo or carrying food aid, those are all excluded from having to pay Annex 2 fees. One particularly interesting feature is what's called the remission option, too, which is if an operator places an order for a U.S.-built equivalent vessel, that operator can apply for a fee waiver or a reduction under certain conditions for a vessel that would otherwise be subject to the Annex 2 fees. All right, we'll take a look at Annex 3 then, which shifts to a very specific part of the global fleet. It shifts to vehicle carriers. Under this annex, then the sort of structure mirrors the approach in Annex 1. It's a tonnage-based fee and sort of calibrated to reflect the ship's capacity, reflect the frequency of U.S. port calls. But there are some, unlike with it, we kind of have a bit of a middle ground in terms of exemptions. We'd have more than we have in Annex 1, but not as many as we have in Annex 2. There are some fairly targeted exemptions. It's for carriers operating under U.S. government contracts, some very smaller vehicle carriers. Those sorts of exemptions exist. And there has been an announcement of a deferment where some of these carriers, this is not to say they're not liable for payments, they are, but they don't have to pay certain ones till December 10th, which is when a comment period ends. And there will be, in theory, would be an announcement from USTR about potential changes to the fee structure for certain vessels. And then just like with Annex 2, the remission option is also available for Annex 3 vessels. That's purchasing a US-built equivalent. And while before you take delivery of that vessel, as long as you have that contract in place, you at least theoretically could get fee reductions or fee waivers for a vessel subject to Annex 3. So finally, Annex 4 outlines new rules for vessels carrying LNG exports. This is different, and you see on the screen, there's nothing about any specific monetary fee being applied. Further, there are no restrictions in place until April 17th, 2028. That's 3 years after the date of USTR's original announcement, or sort of announcement of these fees. After that date, an increasing share of LNG exports have to move on US built, US flagged, and US operated vessels. Operators will need a license under Annex 4. They'll need to meet certain annual requirements. They'll have to report LNG exports by vessel type. And then they also can get that exemption if they've ordered a US built LNG vessel of equal or greater capacity to one that would be subject to these restrictions. But again, none of this would start until April of 2028. All right, that was diving into the what of this fee regime, but how is this fee regime being implemented? So the actual mechanics of implementation that we've seen over the last 2.5 weeks or so, it is still somewhat uncertain. CBP has clarified a few things. CBP is U.S. Customs and Border Protection. That's the government, U.S. government agency responsible for the implementation of this fee regime. CBP clarified that it's the vessel operator's responsibility, not CBP's, to determine whether a fee applies. And CBP also indicated that any required payments should be made at least 3 days prior to the ship's arrival to try and avoid any issues or delays. But because the guidance has been somewhat uneven, and because the United States is just simply a really big country with lots of ports and significant delegated authority to the port level, or down to the port level, there's always a risk of misapplication or inconsistent enforcement by CBP or other U.S. authorities. And that, of course, carries risk. Without proof of payment, this is whether a vessel was, if a vessel was supposed to make a payment and then did, but doesn't have proof of it, or whether a vessel, the operator saying, well, we don't need to make a payment and there's a dispute about that. All those sorts of things can happen. And what would then result is that vessels could experience loading or unloading delays. They wouldn't get permission to do so from CBP, or they even could have clearance to enter withheld. Those risks, obviously, or if those risks were to occur, that would result in significant costs to operators. So given the potential financial impact, not just of the fees themselves, but of the costs involved in any delays, it's really important for operators well in advance of their vessel calling a U.S. port to accurately assess whether the fees apply to them, and then prepare when the fees do apply, is prepare for payment at least 3 business days ahead to help avoid unnecessary delays. So that's all well and good, but how do we know if a fee applies? For Annex 3, it's really simple. If the vessel is a vehicle carrier, it's built outside the United States, you pay the fee. For Annex 2, if the vessel is built in China and does not fall under any other annex, it pays the fee. But for Annex 1, and this is a question we've been getting a lot, is how do we determine if the vessel owner or operator are Chinese? And for the vessel operator, this can be particularly tricky. This is definitely one of the most common questions we're being asked. And to answer it, let's talk about some mechanics for a second. What you see on the screen is the CBP Form 1300. It's used for vessel entrance and clearance. And the area highlighted in red, which you made a little bit bigger there, it's where we enter vessel particulars, such as its name, where it was built, its owner, and its operator. And then block 9 that we see here, that's where we enter the operator's information, the name and country of the operator. Right? That's CBP's Form 1300. Then this is the U.S. Coast Guard form that is the application for the vessel's Certificate of Financial Responsibility, or COFA. And in block 1 of the COFA application, we need to enter the name of the applicant for the COFA. That's the name of the vessel's operator. What CBP has said, though, so let's look at these two. That's CBP 1300 at the top, the COFA application at the bottom. CBP has said that for the purposes of this USTR fee, these 2 blocks, CBP Form 1300, the U.S. Coast Guard application for the COFA, these 2 blocks have to align. They have to align unless there is a verifiable charter party or other lease that identifies a different company as the operator. If these two blocks are not going to be the same, we need to have a verified document that demonstrates why, right? And CBP can go deeper than just sort of looking at these 2 forms. They can choose to investigate further if they'd like. So we need to be very careful with these forms, very careful how we fill these out, and that we have documentation to support it. Right? It means that every vessel calling at a U.S. port now has to be prepared to provide clear, verifiable documentation of its ownership structure, of its place of construction, and of the entity responsible for its operation. What this means then, by extension, is that companies need to take a closer look at their group structures, at their fleet arrangements, all this to avoid sort of unintended exposure. Um, this clarification from CBP has raised some concerns, particularly for registered owners who are still listed on the COFR even after they've chartered out the vessel. It's also raised concerns for bareboat charters who maybe are concerned they don't have proper indemnities in place. And even this could be a concern from time charters whose operational control doesn't kind of fully align with who the COFR holder is. Understanding all of this in advance and understanding who's responsible for determining all this in our organizations is a key to minimizing this documentation risk. So that's the first concern, probably the most common concern one of the two most common concerns we've seen. The second one then is, okay, we've handled the paperwork, we've determined that we need to pay a fee. How do we do it? Again, let's talk mechanics. So these fees have to be made through the US government pay portal at pay.gov. You see it on the screen there. This is the Section 301 Chinese vessel fee payment. Once we click through to the form here, this is a whole website. There's a whole kind of, you scroll down and there's a lot of information, but this is the top of it where we begin to enter our vessel particulars. After we've entered all of our information, down at the bottom of the page, this is what it looks like at the bottom. It's where we make the payment. The challenge is the only way to make payment is via a transfer from a US bank account. And that, of course, is a problem if a vessel operator that needs to pay a fee doesn't have a US bank account. So we have created a service to help clients with it. We've had a bunch of folks reach out to us about this, but how do we solve this issue? Because we really want to avoid those delays that can occur. So we're helping through our fee clearinghouse service. We streamline payments. We help prevent delays by facilitating these payments on behalf of operators who need to make them, all to avoid those sorts of costly delays that unfortunately some are seeing. And we can talk about this more toward the end of the webinar, answer any specific questions. So that was a fairly detailed discussion of how the US government will implement this fee regime, or at least is implementing this fee regime at the moment. But what are some of the potential implications going forward? So first and foremost, and something that we've begun to see, is the imposition of these fees has given rise to a heightened risk of disputes under charter parties. Generally, we're seeing owners are adopting the position, understandably, that these USTR fees are for the charter's account because these fees arise out of charter's orders for US port calls. And then charters, for their part, are arguing that, whoa, no. Hold on, these fees arise from matters that relate to either the vessel or the owners, and those are not matters for us. So, depending on the charter party wording in question, there's definitely some scope for uncertainty and therefore scope for disputes to arise. So this triggers a need to review and potentially renegotiate existing charter party agreements. We need to assess if current contractual terms kind of do in fact allocate responsibility for these fees, or whether unfortunately these fees fall outside the scope of existing clauses. This is particularly problematic in contracts that are silent or ambiguous regarding these sorts of regulatory changes when they happen kind of during the course of the agreement. BIMCO recently published a very helpful clause. They're calling it the USTR clause. It's designed to address uncertainties that are arising from this fee regime. It's designed to clarify the allocation of risk and responsibility between the owners and charters, and hopefully avoid these sorts of disputes. Very useful to take a look at and consider whether it's right for your situation. So there's clearly a heightened risk of contract disputes that we're seeing kind of every day, but there are also some sort of broader geopolitical and global trade implications that we need to contend with. As we all know and are waiting to see what happens with, in regard to any suspension, on October 10th, that's 4 days before the US fees were to go into place. China's Ministry of Transport announced a set of retaliatory measures that came into effect on October 14th, same time as the U.S. fees. And China's measures closely mirrored USTR's. You can see on the screen who the measures target. They include just about any U.S. linked vessel, and the fees start at roughly $56 per ton, and they go up over time. And what we've seen then with these fees in place is we've seen some mirror image effects. We've seen Chinese linked vessels being diverted from US port calls. We've seen US linked vessels being diverted from Chinese port calls. The situation obviously remains somewhat fluid. And as we've been saying for the last 2 weeks, there's nothing to guarantee that the US and China won't change requirements. They won't change thresholds. They won't change rates. They won't make an announcement that they're suspending these fees for a year, but then provide no details about this. It's a very volatile situation. It's just adding additional volatility to what is already a pretty uncertain situation. So where does this leave us? So putting the potential suspension to the side, because we have no details about it, it has not been formalized. So where do we stand as of today? So there are two sets of implications to consider. Right, we know that companies are facing high voyage costs. We know that freight rates are for the large part of there's been some pressure on them, and there's also been pressure on compliance requirements. There's been pressure on cash flow. There's been pressure on administrative processes, and there's been a growing tension in contracts and charter party agreements. At a more global level, we've been dealing with network disruptions. We've been dealing with changing routes and schedules. There have been ripple effects, sort of additional ripple effects that vary by sector. And these shifts are they're driving companies to rethink competitive positioning, rethink fleet strategies. But overall, the key message that underlies all this is clear, is that we need to be prepared for ongoing policy shifts. We're living that in the last 24 hours. We need to be prepared for continued commercial uncertainty, and we need to be prepared for this uncertainty to exist across both operational and strategic fronts. So that is all for the presentation. Thank you so much for your time, for listening. I'm going to see if I can stop sharing screen, and we'll be ready to take questions.
Yeah, Andrew, thank you for that. That was a very clear and a very sort of wide-ranging overview of these new port fee regimes. While we wait for people to put questions to you, I guess the biggest issue of concern to people listening into this webinar today is, what the current situation stroke state of play is. I mean, for example, I just picked up there on the vehicle carrier aspect. Obviously, everybody euphemistically refers to these as Chinese linked port fees. But of course, as you point out, the vehicle carriers don't necessarily need a Chinese link. They need to be a foreign vehicle carrier. Insofar as the rumor mill has been sort of reported on by trade winds and the like, the suggestion is that there's some sort of agreement between China and the US. But insofar as the vehicle carriers are not Chinese or Chinese linked, how would any changes to this policy affect those sorts of vessels?
Great question, and it's one that we simply don't know the answer to. It depends on how USTR chooses to formalize this suspension. Right? We don't know what suspension really means at this point because they haven't made any sort of announcement about. There's questions, as you point out, Tom, about Annex 3 vessels, those vehicle carriers that aren't China linked, but Chinese linked, but are still subject to fees. There's also questions about whether anyone who's paid fees over the last couple of weeks will be able to get refunds. There's questions about when, in fact, the suspension would go into effect. Would it be tomorrow? Would it be a week from now? Would it be 3 weeks from now? We just simply don't know until they make a formal statement of such.
And I have to assume that you've been making inquiries of the USTR department in the United States, in Washington. There, have you any news on when they may be giving some more firm advice on how the announcement's going to affect the implementation of this new regime?
Yeah, so everything's been pretty tight-lipped. One of the other wrinkles that's been affecting things is there's been a shutdown of large parts of the U.S. government. Some are still, there's no budget at the moment. Congress is deadlocked on that. So some employees of the U.S. government are still working. They're doing so without pay. Many others have been furloughed, meaning they're neither working nor being paid. So because of that sort of raw numeric capacity has been limited. So getting information has at times been a challenge.
Yeah, thanks for that. In terms of the interplay between the CBP 1300 form and the COFA application, obviously you flagged issues around the same information being entered when submitting the 1300 and applying for the COFA. Obviously, many of these vessels are operated internationally and managed internationally. Are there any issues around changing the domicile of the management of these vessels within these forms, or is there anything to be concerned about in that respect?
So every situation is obviously unique, but the key in all this is to ensure that you have verifiable, legitimate documentation of any changes. That's what's most important. We need to be able to stand up to due diligence, stand up to sort of appropriate levels of scrutiny of our documentation. Changes are made all the time. That isn't a problem. Changes that are made that can't be backed up by documentation, that are simply made just on paper to avoid fees, would be problematic with any scrutiny from CBP. So we just need to be cognizant of that.
Okay, well, I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of our half an hour. I would encourage anybody listening in, if they have any last minute questions they'd like to submit on the chat, we'd be happy to answer them. If not, I think we can probably bring the seminar to a close. So I think if there's no further question, oh, hang on a second. Okay, so managers are recently faced with pressure from owners to name themselves as operators in the forms for these special port changes. Generally, operators should be the entities to have commercial control of the employment of the vessel. Is there a definition of operators under a US law or other international conventions? Do you want to address that question quickly, Andrew?
Sure. So, to address it quickly, the sort of bottom line is it's in the entity that has genuine operational control of the vessel. We've had instances where there have been managers who are faced with that pressure to name themselves as the operator, even though they have absolutely zero operational control. That should be avoided. The same with any owners who don't have any, who've kind of chartered their vessel such that they have no operational control. That's sort of the bottom line without diving into legal specifics as we're going past our time.
Yeah. So just beware. I mean, obviously, there's got to be a clear contractual nexus to the party that's named as the operator of that vessel. It can't be for convenience purposes, and there has to be clear documentary trail of that contractual nexus. Is I guess what you're trying to say, yeah?
Yep, that's exactly it.
And just before we go to closing remarks, I mean, what would be your advice to ship owners, operators, managers right now? This sort of, I feel as though we're in a kind of hiatus where there's no real certainty around, any real certainty for ship owners, operators, trading to the States at the minute. What's the best advice you can give them in terms of the application of these USTR rules?
In the context of the suspension, or in context of the sort of potential suspension,
well,
or where we are in that regard?
Yeah,
we are all in the same boat at the moment of waiting for the formalization of such. At the moment, our understanding is CBP is required to continue to collect these fees. That's what the law says right now in the United States, that they need to collect these under the sort of action that USTR has taken. Until there is a formal document, a formal notice of action changing that, this continues to be our status quo. We will share via our circulars and also post on our LinkedIn page any changes to that as they hopefully happen. today, over the weekend, early next week. But at the moment, we should all consider that there has been no formal change and we're operating just as we were, say, on Monday or Tuesday of this week.
Excellent. Well, Andrew, fantastic presentation. Thank you very much for taking the time to put that together. For people who've given it their time to join us today, I'm sure people will have got a great deal from presentation. So I'd just like to thank you for sharing your insights and really to thank everyone who joined us today for your time, for your attention. I know it's precious these days. I mean, if you'd like to follow up with Andrew, he's great at answering these difficult questions. He can be contacted on andrew.baskin@analytics.com, or you can reach out to our specific team for these matters, 301 payment at hudmarine.com. A recording of today's session and a copy of the presentation will be circulated shortly. And as Andrew says, we'll continue to try and keep you informed as the USTR guidance evolves via our social pages, via our general communications to our clients. And so on behalf of the Shoreline Hudson team, thank you. Please stay compliant. Please have a great day. And until next time, we really thank you for joining us today.